the world had bled its color out. For 6 days. That was Clara Belle's prevailing thought. The relentless sun had bleached the sky to a pale, hazy blue, and baked the very earth into 1,000 shades of brown and ochre. The soft greens and tamed hills of Pennsylvania were a distant memory, a lifetime ago, replaced by an endless, undulating landscape of rock, sand, and defiant, thorny scrub. The stagecoach, a cramped and rattling wooden box on wheels, was its own special kind of purgatory, filled with the constant creak of leather, the groan of axles, and the fine, pervasive dust that settled on everything in her throat, on her lashes, in the very folds of her dark wool dress. She sat pressed against the window, her bonnet having long since failed to keep the glare from her eyes. The other passengers, a portly salesman with a sweat-stained collar and a quiet, severe-looking woman with 2 listless children, had mostly fallen into a resigned silence days ago. Conversation had been baked out of them, leaving only the shared misery of the journey. Clara didn't mind. The silence gave her room to think, to brace herself against the collision of hope and fear that churned within her. Hope had been the fuel for this journey. It had come in the form of letters, written in a confident, looping script on thin, precious paper. Letters from a man named William Prescott, a man she'd known only through his words. He was a distant cousin of a neighbor back east, a man who had gone west 2 years prior and wrote back of a land of boundless opportunity. His letters spoke of building a life from the ground up, of clear skies and a future as wide as the horizon itself. He had written to her specifically after hearing she was still unmarried, his words painting a picture of a partnership, a respectable life for a woman of good character and spirit. He had never seen her, but his letters felt like a promise, a home. Fear was the cargo she carried within her, heavier than the sturdy wooden trunk strapped to the back of the coach. Fear was the reason she had accepted the proposal of a man she'd never met. It was the echo of another man's voice, a voice much closer and more familiar than William's, soft with pity but sharp with rejection. Clara, you are a fine woman, honest and true, but society, it has its expectations. A man in my position requires a wife without distractions. Her fingers instinctively ghosted over the thin, silver line that traced from her temple to the high curve of her cheekbone. It was the legacy of a childhood fall, a foolish accident involving a stone hearth and a moment of carelessness. It wasn't grotesque or horrifying, but it was there, an unalterable fact of her face. In the drawing rooms of Philadelphia, where women were prized for their porcelain complexions and unblemished beauty, her scar was a quiet but constant pronouncement of her imperfection. It made suitors hesitate. It made mothers of eligible sons look away. And it had made Arthur, the man she had thought she would marry, finally, gently, cast her aside for a younger, smoother-faced bride. The rejection hadn't just broken her heart. It had fractured her sense of place in the world. She was 26, a dangerous age for an unmarried woman in a society that saw her as little more than a future wife and mother. Her blunt honesty, a trait her father had praised as forthrightness, was deemed unladylike. Her love for reading books on botany and history was seen as peculiar. The scar was simply the physical manifestation of all the ways she didn't quite fit. William Prescott's letters, arriving like a godsend, offered an escape not just from spinsterhood, but from a world that had measured her and found her wanting. The West, he'd written, didn't care for porcelain skin. It cared for grit. It cared for substance. End of the line. Folks, welcome to redemption. The driver's voice, a gravelly rasp, jolted her from her reverie. The coach gave a final, bone-jarring lurch and shuddered to a halt. The salesman grunted as he roused himself, and the woman began gathering her children with a weary sigh. For a moment, Clara couldn't move. Redemption. The name felt like either a cruel joke or a divine sign, and she wasn't sure which. She adjusted her bonnet, took a steadying breath, and waited for the door to be unlatched. When it swung open, it was like opening an oven. A wave of heat rose from the ground, smelling of dust, dry wood, and something faintly acrid, like cheap whiskey. She gathered her reticule and stepped carefully down the high, worn steps. Her boots sank into an inn of fine, pale dust that coated the single main street. Redemption wasn't a town so much as a suggestion of one, a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings huddled together under the immense, indifferent sky. A long building with swinging doors identified itself as the Gilded Nugget Saloon. Across from it was a general store, its porch sagging under the weight of barrels and crates. Further down, she could see a blacksmith's forge, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on anvil ringing sharp and clear in the still air. There were a few other nondescript structures and, beyond them, nothing but the vast, empty expanse she had been staring at for a week. There were people, but not many. A few wiry men in dusty hats paused on the boardwalk to watch the stagecoach's arrival, their faces weathered and unreadable. A woman in a faded calico dress swept the porch of the general store, her movements slow and methodical, barely glancing their way. The air was thick with a sense of waiting, of impermanence, as if the entire town might pack up and disappear with the next strong wind. It was a far cry from the bustling, prosperous community William's letters had described. The driver, a burly man with a beard full of trail dust, grunted as he unstrapped her trunk and lowered it to the ground with a solid thud. It landed with a puff of dust, looking suddenly very solid and very final. "That'll be all, ma'am," he said, not unkindly. He tipped his hat an inch. "Good luck to you." The other passengers dispersed quickly, the salesman heading straight for the saloon and the woman herding her children toward a small cabin at the edge of town. The driver climbed back onto his seat, cracked his whip, and with another groan of wood and leather, the stagecoach rumbled on, leaving Clara standing alone beside her trunk in the middle of the street. The silence that descended was profound. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer had stopped. The stares of the men on the boardwalk felt heavy, not with malice, but with a flat, assessing curiosity. She was new. She was a woman, alone. She was an event. She felt her skin prickle, and the scar on her cheek seemed to throb with a life of its own, a beacon announcing her otherness. For a terrifying moment, the hope that had carried her 2,000 miles evaporated, leaving only a cold, hard knot of fear in its place. What if William wasn't here? What if he had changed his mind? What if he took one look at her and she saw the same polite disappointment she had seen in Arthur's eyes? She clutched her reticule, its velvet worn smooth from her anxious grip. Inside were his letters, the tangible proof of his promise. "I will be waiting for the Tuesday stage." His last letter had said, "Just ask for William Prescott at the land office. Everyone knows me." Straightening her shoulders, she forced a composure she did not feel. She was Clara Bell. She had crossed a continent. She would not be undone by a dusty street and a few curious stares. She focused on the building with the words Land and Assay Office painted in faded letters on its false front. That was her destination. That was where her new life was supposed to begin. She began to walk, her steps deliberate, her gaze fixed forward. The dust puffed up around her ankles. The sun beat down on her back. With every step, she could feel the weight of the past pressing on her, the memory of that final conversation with Arthur. He had tried to be kind, which had somehow made it worse. He'd spoken of her practical nature and her strength of character, all the virtues that were meant to console a woman who was not beautiful. He'd made it sound as though he were doing her a favor by releasing her to a life more suited to her plain, sensible self. The real cruelty was that she had almost believed him. For weeks after, she had looked at her reflection and seen only the flaw, the line that marked her as incomplete. It was her father's voice that had pulled her back. "Clara," he used to say, his hand smelling of soil from his garden, "that mark on your face is a sign you survived a fall. It's proof you get back up. Some people are born perfect. The rest of us are made strong." She was strong. She had to be. the fire in her heart, the one that longed for a place to belong, for a hand to hold that wouldn't flinch away, had not been extinguished. It was banked low, shielded against the harsh winds of disappointment, but it was still there, an ember of hope, glowing stubbornly in the darkness. She reached the boardwalk in front of the land office and paused, gathering her courage before stepping into the shade of the porch. The door was closed. She could see figures moving through the grimy window pane. This was it, the moment of truth. She would walk through that door, announce her name, and William Prescott would turn around. He would see her, really see her, the dust, the exhaustion, the scar, and all. And in his eyes, she would find either the home she had been promised or another closed door. She took a breath, held it, and then took the first step up onto the boardwalk, the wood creaking a solemn welcome beneath her feet. The handle of the land office door was warm beneath Clara's gloved hand. She pushed, and the door swung inward with a protesting squeal, releasing a wave of air thick with the smells of stale cigar smoke, ink, and dry paper. The room was larger than it appeared from the outside, but it felt cramped, crowded with a raw, masculine energy that was immediately overwhelming. Sunlight struggled through the two tall, dirt-streaked windows at the front, cutting dusty golden shafts through the gloom. Maps showing grids of unclaimed territory were tacked to the rough-hewn plank walls, their edges curled and yellowed. A long counter ran the length of one side of the room, behind which a harried-looking man with a green eye shade shuffled through ledgers. But the room's center of gravity was a group of 5 or 6 men clustered around a large table, upon which a detailed map was unrolled. They were a motley collection prospectors in mud-caked boots, a rancher with a sprawling cattle brand on his belt buckle, and 2 men who looked more like investors from back east, their coats of a finer cut than anything else in the room. And at the head of the table, pointing a decisive finger at a section of the map, was a man who could only be William Prescott. He matched the confident tone of his letters. He was tall, with light brown hair neatly combed and a clean-shaven jaw that seemed at odds with the scruffy faces around him. His shirt was clean, his waistcoat buttoned, and he carried himself with an air of importance, of a man who was orchestrating the taming of this wild land one plotted square at a time. He was handsome, in a polished, civilized way that felt both reassuringly familiar and jarringly out of place. Clara's heart gave a hopeful flutter. This was him. This was the man who had promised her a future. She moved forward tentatively, her boots making a soft, hesitant sound on the dusty floorboards. The men at the table were deep in conversation, their voices a low rumble of words like water rights, acreage, and survey lines. They didn't seem to notice her. She waited for a pause, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, but none came. William spoke with authority, his voice clear and carrying, and the other men listened, nodding or arguing a point before deferring to his judgment. Finally, mustering her courage, she cleared her throat. It was a small sound, easily lost, but it was enough. One of the investors glanced over, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance at the interruption. His gaze flickered to Clara's face, lingered for a fraction of a second on her scar, and then dismissed her. William, however, finally looked up, his blue eyes sweeping over her. "Can I help you, madam?" he asked. His tone wasn't unkind, but it was the brisk, impersonal tone of a busy man addressing a stranger. Clara's throat felt dry. "Mr. Prescott, Mr. William Prescott." "I am," he confirmed, his attention already starting to drift back to the map. "I am Clara Bell." She said her own name as if it were a password, the key that would unlock the recognition and welcome she had traveled so far to find. She watched his face, waiting for the spark of understanding, for the smile that would say, "You're here, I've been waiting." Instead, his brow furrowed in momentary confusion. "Clara Bell," he repeated slowly, the name holding no meaning for him. Then, A faint light of recollection dawned in his eyes, followed immediately by something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't a smile. It was a flicker of calculation. He looked at her again, a proper assessment this time, from the dust on the hem of her dress to the weariness in her eyes, and finally, to the thin silver line on her cheek. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, Miss Bell, from Pennsylvania," he said, his voice losing its earlier warmth. "The Tuesday stage. I had forgotten." He had forgotten. The words landed like small, sharp stones. All her weeks of travel, of anticipation, of rereading his letters until the creases fell apart. And he had forgotten she was arriving. He turned to the men at the table. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me for one moment." He walked toward her, stopping a respectable distance away. Up close, she could see a small, vein part in his hair and smell the faint, clean scent of bay rum. "Miss Bell," he began, his voice lowered, "this is a rather inconvenient time. As you can see, we are in the midst of a significant land negotiation." "I'm sorry to intrude," she stammered, feeling her face flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "Your letter said to ask for you. I thought—" "Yes, well, things move quickly out here. Opportunities arise." He glanced back toward the table, his impatience a palpable thing. "Listen, the boarding house is just 2 doors down from the saloon. Mrs. Gable runs it. Secure yourself a room. We will speak later, when I am not so occupied." It was a dismissal, a cold, clear dismissal. He had looked at her, and in that single sweeping glance, she had been weighed, measured, and set aside. He wasn't just busy. He was disappointed. She had seen that look before. It was Arthur's polite regret, repackaged in the brusque manner of the frontier. Before she could form a reply, he had already turned his back on her and returned to the table, his voice once again authoritative as he pointed to the map. "Now, about the access to the creek." Clara stood frozen for a moment, the sound of their negotiations buzzing in her ears like angry hornets. The men didn't even spare her a second glance. She was an interruption that had been dealt with. Humiliation, sharp and bitter, rose in her throat. She turned and walked out of the office, her back ramrod straight, her mind a chaotic whirl of disbelief and pain. The door squealed shut behind her, cutting off the sound of the men and leaving her once again in the oppressive heat and silence of the street. She stood on the boardwalk, blinking against the brutal glare of the sun. The town seemed harsher now, the buildings more skeletal, the dust more suffocating. She had traveled 2,000 miles for a man who had forgotten she was coming and who, upon seeing her, had immediately sought to postpone their meeting. "We will speak later." The words were a hollow echo, devoid of the promise his letters had held. A sudden, fierce gust of wind swept down the street, lifting a vortex of dust and grit. It tore at her bonnet, whipping the ribbons across her face. Instinctively, she reached up to hold it in place, and in that moment, the fine lace handkerchief she had tucked into her cuff was pulled free. It was a small, treasured thing, a gift from her mother, embroidered with tiny blue forget-me-nots. She watched in helpless dismay as it cartwheeled through the air, a fragile white speck against the brown dust. It landed in the middle of the street, immediately stained by the filth. A wave of despair washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. It was just a piece of cloth, but in that moment, it felt like the last vestige of her former life, of her dignity, now soiled and abandoned in the dirt of this God-forsaken place. It felt like a symbol of her own foolish journey. She made a move to step off the boardwalk to retrieve it, to salvage that one small piece of herself. But a Fager moved before she could. He seemed to emerge from the stillness itself. He'd been leaning against a porch support of the general store across the street, half hidden in the shadows. But she hadn't truly noticed him until he moved. He wasn't large or imposing like the rancher in the land office, nor was he polished like William. He was lean, wiry, with the kind of spare frame that spoke of a life with no excess. His clothes, denim trousers worn pale at the knees, and a simple cotton shirt were clean, but faded by the sun and softened by countless washings. A low-slung gun belt rested on his hips with a natural, unthreatening ease, and his hat was pulled low, its brim casting a deep shadow over his face. He moved with a quiet, unhurried grace, his worn boots making almost no sound in the thick dust. He bent down, picked up the handkerchief, and with two sharp, efficient snaps of his wrist, shook the worst of the dust from it. He walked toward her, stopping at the edge of the boardwalk and looking up. When he lifted his head, the shadow of his hat brim receded, and she saw his face for the first time. It was a study in sun and wind. His skin was tanned to the color of worn leather, etched with fine lines around his eyes. He might have been 30, or he might have been 40. The land aged men harshly out here. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, clear gray, the color of the sky just before a storm, and they were utterly, unnervously calm. There was no judgment in them, no pity, no flicker of surprise as his gaze passed over her scar. He simply looked at her, his expression as placid and patient as the desert itself. He held out the handkerchief. His hands were lean and calloused, the knuckles prominent, the hands of a man who worked. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and quiet, with a slight rasp, like stones tumbling in a slow-moving river. Clara reached out and took the handkerchief. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt the rough, warm texture of his skin. The simple, unexpected contact sent a jolt through her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She couldn't seem to look away from his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't smile, but the calmness in his gaze was more reassuring than any smile could have been. He seemed to see her not the dusty traveler, not the inconvenient arrival, not the flawed woman, but just her, a person standing on a boardwalk in a strange town. "Wind's got a habit of stealing things that aren't tied down," he observed quietly. His gaze shifted for a moment, down the street and back. "This town does, too." It wasn't a warning, not exactly. It was a simple statement of fact, offered without agenda. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect as old as the hills around them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back across the street, melting back into the shadows from which he'd come. He didn't look back. Clara stood there, clutching the dusty piece of lace in her hand. The street was empty again. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, but it had shifted something inside her. The sharp, stinging humiliation from William's dismissal began to recede, replaced by a strange sense of calm. She had been offered a moment of simple, human decency, with no questions asked and nothing expected in return. The stranger hadn't tried to charm her or impress her or assess her worth. He had just seen something that needed doing, and he had done it. She looked at the handkerchief, at the brown dust still clinging to the delicate blue threads. It was stained, yes, but it was back in her hand. It wasn't lost. She lifted her chin and looked back at the closed door of the Land and Assay office. William Prescott was in there, building his future, a future he had invited her to share, and then, with a glance, seemed to have revoked. The fear was still there, the cold dread of being abandoned so far from home, but it was no longer all-consuming. That quiet cowboy, with his calm gray eyes and his few, plain words, had given her an anchor. He had reminded her that this town was more than just one man. Her hope had been tested, and it had been badly shaken, but it wasn't broken. The ember still glowed. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Clara folded the handkerchief, tucked it securely back into her cuff, and began walking toward the boarding house. She would get a room, and then she would wait for Mr. Prescott. But she would not wait as a supplicant. She would wait as Clara Bell, a woman who had survived a fall, a woman who knew how to get back up. The boarding house was an island of order in the sea of dust. It was run by a widow named Martha Gable, a woman whose frame was as sturdy and unadorned as the building she managed. Her face was a roadmap of her life, etched with lines of worry and resilience, but her eyes were sharp and missed nothing. She showed Clara to a small, scrupulously clean room at the back of the house, furnished with a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a single straight-backed chair. The window looked out onto a dusty yard where a few listless chickens pecked at the unforgiving ground. "Supper is at 6, Mrs.," Gable stated, her voice flat but not unkind. "The bell will ring. Pay for the room is $1 a week. In advance. Supper is extra." Clara paid for the first week from the small store of money she had carefully guarded on her journey. The jingle of the coins as Mrs. Gable dropped them into her apron pocket sounded unnervingly final. "I'm here to meet Mr. Prescott," Clara found herself explaining, as if the words themselves could solidify her claim. "He is expecting me." Mrs. Gable's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something knowledge, perhaps even pity, passed through her eyes. "Mr. Prescott is a very busy man, always planning, building the future of this town. He is," she smoothed her apron. "I'm sure he'll be by when his business is concluded." The afternoon stretched into an eternity. Clara washed her face and hands, the cool water a temporary balm against the oppressive heat and the sting of her humiliation. She tried to unpack, but the act of placing her few belongings in the small chest of drawers felt presumptuous, an assertion of permanence she no longer felt she possessed. She sat on the stiff chair, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. The sounds of the town filtered in through the open window, the relentless clang from the blacksmith's forge, the distant shouts of men, the sudden, startling bray of a mule. Each sound emphasized her isolation. She tried to rationalize William's behavior. He was a man of importance. As Mrs. Gable had said, of course he was busy. A land negotiation was no small thing. It was foolish of her to expect him to drop everything for her arrival. His letters had spoken of his ambition, his drive to make something of himself in this new land. She should admire that, not feel slighted by it. She was being sensitive, a trait she had been warned against her whole life. He had said they would speak later. She simply had to be patient. When the supper bell rang, its clang loud and insistent, Clara's stomach clenched with nerves. She smoothed her dress, checked her hair in the small, wavy mirror above the washstand, and took a deep breath before making her way to the common room. The room was already half full. 3 miners sat at one end of the long trestle table, their faces still smudged with grime despite their washed hands, shoveling food into their mouths with grim efficiency. A lone trapper, smelling of wood smoke and leather, ate in silence, his knife moving with practiced skill. They all looked up as she entered, and a sudden, heavy silence fell over the room. Their gazes were direct and assessing, the undisguised curiosity of men who saw few new faces, and even fewer unescorted women. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, and her scar felt as if it were glowing under their collective stare. Mrs. Gable emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming platter of beans and salt pork. "Find a seat. Miss Bell," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. Clara slid onto the bench at the far end of the table, as far from the others as she could manage. She accepted a plate, her hands trembling slightly. She tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. The silence was eventually broken as the men resumed their low, rumbling conversations, but Clara felt their occasional, sidelong glances. They were speculating. She was the woman who had arrived on the stagecoach, the one who had asked for William Prescott. News, she was quickly learning, traveled faster than a horse in a town this small. She was an object of gossip before she had even been there a day. The meal was an ordeal. Every minute that passed without William's arrival felt like another small nail being hammered into the coffin of her hopes. By the time she escaped back to the sanctuary of her room, the sun was setting, painting the bleached sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. She lit the small oil lamp on her washstand, its yellow glow pushing back the encroaching shadows but doing little to dispel the gloom in her heart. She waited. The sounds of the town changed as evening fell. The blacksmith's hammer was silenced. Rowdy laughter and the tinny, cheerful sound of a piano began to drift from the gilded Nugget saloon. A dog barked, a long, lonely sound. Still, William did not come. The patience she had clung to all afternoon began to fray, exposing the raw fear beneath. He wasn't just busy. This was a deliberate avoidance. It was nearly 9 o'clock when a firm knock finally came at her door. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was him. He had come. She smoothed her dress one last time, took a breath to calm her racing pulse, and opened the door. William Prescott stood in the hallway. He had changed his clothes. He now wore a dark, well-tailored coat and a starched collar. He looked even more out of place in the rustic boarding house than he had in his own office. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning the brim nervously. "Miss Bell," he said, his voice a low, formal murmur. "May I have a word, perhaps in the parlor? It is more suitable." The parlor was a small, stuffy room off the common area, furnished with a horsehair sofa and 2 stiff armchairs. A few of the boarders were still in the common room, and Clara could feel their eyes on her back as she followed William into the parlor, and he closed the door behind them. The illusion of privacy only made the encounter more fraught. He did not invite her to sit. He remained standing in the center of the room, the lamp on a nearby table casting shadows across his handsome, troubled face. "I must apologize for the delay," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "The deal I was working on, it is of monumental importance to the future of redemption. I was unable to break away until now." "I understand," Clara said, though she didn't. Good, he said quickly. "You are a practical woman. I sense that about you. It is one of the reasons I wrote." He paused, and for the first time, he seemed to be at a loss for words. He cleared his throat. "Miss Bell, Clara, the correspondence we have shared over these past months has been a pleasant diversion for a man in a lonely and demanding place. A pleasant diversion." The words were a cold splash of water. Her dreams, her hopes, her entire 2,000-mile journey had been a diversion for him. "I fear," he continued, his gaze not quite meeting hers, "that in my enthusiasm for the potential of this land, and in my own loneliness, I may have misrepresented the situation, or, rather, allowed you to form a picture that is not entirely aligned with the reality of my ambitions." Clara said nothing. She simply stood before him, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, and waited for the axe to fall. To build a town, to create a society out of this wilderness, one needs more than just grit and determination, he explained, his voice taking on a professorial tone. One needs capital, one needs investors from the East. One needs to project an image of stability, of refinement, of success. A man in my position requires a wife who can be a partner in that endeavor, a hostess, a woman who can charm and reassure the very people whose money we need. He finally looked at her then, his eyes filled with a kind of resigned, apologetic frankness that was more cruel than any anger. "The woman I envisioned, the woman I need," he said softly, "is not you." The words hung in the air between them, stark and brutal and undeniable. It wasn't just her scar. It was everything. Her plain dress, her direct gaze, her lack of practiced social graces. She was the raw material. He required the finished product. "You are, I am certain, a woman of fine character," he went on, as if offering a consolation prize. "But you do not fit the picture of the life I intend to build. It was a mistake to bring you all this way, and for that, I am truly sorry. It was an error in judgment on my part. The world seemed to tilt. The stuffy little room felt airless, and a roaring sound started in her ears. He had said it. He had said what Arthur had said, but without the pretense of affection. To William, she was merely an asset that had turned out to be unsuitable for his portfolio, an error in judgment. She found her voice, and was surprised by how steady it sounded. "Why did you write the letters, Mr. Prescott?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "As I said, I was lonely. The descriptions I received of you were of a respectable, sensible woman. I thought that would be enough. I did not fully consider all the variables." He gestured vaguely toward her face. "The West is a harsh place, but society, even here, has its expectations." There it was again. The same excuse, the same dismissal. She had fled a world that judged her by its expectations only to find them waiting for her, colder and more pragmatic. At the end of the trail, a cold, clear anger began to burn through the shock. "You are a coward, Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice low but clear. "You hid behind your pretty words and promises because you did not have the courage to be honest. You should have told me the kind of woman you required. You should have sent a list of qualifications, as if hiring a housekeeper." His face flushed. "Now see here, Miss Bell, there is no need for insults." "Isn't there?" she countered, taking a step forward. "You have made a fool of me. You brought me across a continent on a false pretense, and now you dismiss me as an error in judgment in the parlor of a public boarding house. I believe I have earned the right to an insult." He was taken aback by her fire. He clearly expected tears, pleading. He was not prepared for her fury. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather purse. "This was a business arrangement that has not worked out," he said stiffly, his brief moment of discomfort replaced by a chillingly practical demeanor. "I will not see you stranded. This is enough to pay for your room and your passage back east on the next stagecoach." He held the purse out to her. The offer was the final, deepest humiliation. It was blood money, meant to salve his conscience and erase his mistake. Clara looked at the purse, then back at his face. She shook her head. "No. Be reasonable, Miss Bell. You cannot stay here." "I will not take your money," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised them both. "I may have been foolish enough to believe your lies, but I will not be paid off like a disgruntled employee. Keep your money. Mr. Prescott, you will need it to purchase the kind of wife you are looking for." Without waiting for a reply, she turned her back on him, walked out of the parlor, and did not look back. She could feel his stunned silence behind her. She walked through the common room, past the now openly staring boarders, past Mrs. Gable, who stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands and a world of pity in her eyes. She reached her room and shut the door, leaning her back against it as if to physically hold the world at bay. Her legs felt weak, and she slid down the rough wood to sit on the floor. The anger that had sustained her moments before drained away, leaving a vast, hollow emptiness. He had rejected her, utterly and completely. She was alone, with a handful of dollars to her name, in a town that already knew her story, the mail-order bride who wasn't good enough. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Tears she had refused to shed in front of him now burned hot behind her eyes, but they would not fall. The hurt was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard knot of despair in the pit of her stomach. She looked out the window at the sliver of a moon hanging in an ink-black sky, a sky full of cold, distant stars. It was a vast, empty, and indifferent wilderness, and she was utterly, terrifyingly lost within it. Sleep did not come. The night was a long, suffocating darkness filled with the ghosts of William Prescott's words. Clara lay on the thin mattress, her eyes wide open, tracing the patterns of moonlight on the ceiling as they shifted and faded. Each creak of the boarding house, each distant shout from the saloon, was a reminder of where she was a foreign world, a place she had been lured to only to be cast out. The shame was a physical entity, a heavy cloak that threatened to smother her. She had been a fool, a naive, hopeful fool who had mistaken a man's loneliness for a promise of love, and his ambition for an offer of partnership. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, it brought no relief, only a stark illumination of her predicament. She was stranded. The money in her reticule was a pittance, enough for another week or two of lodging and meager meals, but certainly not enough for the long, costly journey back to a home that no longer felt like hers. To return would be to admit defeat, to face the pitying glances and whispered, "I told you so's," of everyone she had ever known. But to stay meant facing a town that had already witnessed her utter humiliation. She was a curiosity, a cautionary tale, the rejected woman. The sounds of redemption waking up began to filter into her room. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer started its daily pulse, a heartbeat for a town that felt utterly heartless. The rumble of a heavy wagon, the lowing of cattle, the murmur of men's voices, it all felt accusatory. She wanted to stay in that room forever, to pull the covers over her head and simply cease to exist. But a more primal, more insistent need began to stir within her survival. Her meager funds would dwindle to nothing if she did nothing. She could not afford the luxury of despair. It took every ounce of her resolve to rise from the bed. She washed her face in the basin of cold water, the shock of it a small, sharp anchor to the present moment. She dressed in her plainest, most durable dress, a dark gray cotton that felt like armor. As she looked at her reflection in the wavy mirror, at the pale face and the tired eyes, she saw the faint silver line of her scar. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker not of shame, but of something else, defiance. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "It's proof you get back up." Getting back up, she knew, meant facing the town. Her first, most practical stop had to be the general store. She needed to inquire about the cost of basic provisions, flour, beans, coffee to see how far her money could stretch. And, though the very thought made her stomach churn, she had to ask about work, any kind of work. The walk from the boarding house to the store was the longest 100 yards of her life. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the eyes on her. The men who lounged on the saloon porch fell silent as she passed. A woman shaking a rug on a second-story balcony paused to watch her. She could feel their whispers, imagine their words. She was a public spectacle. Her private heartbreak was this morning's entertainment. The bell above the general store door announced her arrival with a cheerful, mocking jingle. The store's interior was a cavern of scents and shadows, smelling of coffee beans, cured leather, molasses, and dust. A stout, aproned woman with kind but wary eyes stood behind the counter. She was the proprietor's wife, a Mrs. Hanson. "Good morning," Clara said, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. "Morning. Mrs. Hanson replied, her hands busy arranging a display of tinned peaches. She did not need to ask Clara's name. It was clear she already knew who she was. "What can I get for you?" Clara made a few small purchases, a little coffee, a loaf of bread, her questions about prices confirming her dire financial state. Finally, she gathered her courage. "I was also wondering. I am in need of employment. I am a hard worker. I can cook. I can clean. I am an expert at sewing and mending." "Mrs." Hanson stopped arranging the tins. She looked at Clara, and her expression was one of genuine, uncomfortable pity. "I'm sorry, dear," she said softly. "We're a small operation, just my husband and me. We don't have need for any hired help." She fiddled with a stray thread on her apron. "Things are quiet right now." It was a polite but firm refusal. Clara knew it was more than just a lack of need. To hire her would be to take a side, to involve oneself in the affair of the town's most important man. No one would risk William Prescott's displeasure for the sake of a stranded stranger. "I see," Clara said, the words catching in her throat. Well, thank you for your time. She paid for her items, her hands fumbling with the coins, and turned to leave. The weight of this second, smaller rejection felt immense, a confirmation of her status as an outcast. As she stepped back out into the blinding sunlight, her shoulders slumped. The defiance she had felt that morning had crumbled, leaving only the cold, hard reality of her situation. She was well and truly alone. "Ma'am." The voice was quiet, low, and came from just beside her. She startled, turning to see the lean cowboy from the day before, Jonas Hale. He was standing by a hitching post, a half-empty sack of grain at his feet. He wasn't looking at her with pity or curiosity, but with the same unnerving, placid calmness as before. His gray eyes took in the small parcel in her arms and the look of defeat on her face. "It appears you've found your footing to be a bit unsteady here," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a simple observation, stated as plainly as one might comment on the weather. Clara stiffened, her pride rushing in to fill the void of her despair. "I'm quite all right. Thank you," she replied, her tone clipped and cold. She started to walk away. "Are you?" he asked, his voice stopping her. It held no challenge, only a quiet sincerity that made her defensiveness feel childish. "Forgive me for speaking plain, but this town has ears. I know, mister. Prescott is a man who values his pictures. Sometimes folks don't fit 'em." He knew, of course, he knew. The whole town knew. Hearing it said aloud by this stranger, so simply and without judgment, was both mortifying and, strangely, a relief. The pretense was gone. "What I do is no concern of yours," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Ordinarily, it wouldn't be," he agreed, pushing himself off the post to stand. "But I saw you in the store, and I've seen that look on people's faces before. It's the look of a person trying to figure out how to turn $1 into 10. He paused. "I might know of some work, if you're not too proud to take it." Clara stared at him, suspicion and desperation warring within her. Why would he help her? No one else would. What did this quiet, watchful man want from her? A woman in her position was vulnerable, and she knew that kindness from a strange man often came with unspoken terms. Why, she asked, the single word sharp with distrust. "Why would you do anything for me? I'm a stranger to you." Jonas Hale held her gaze. His expression didn't waver. He seemed to understand her fear, to see the wall she was hiding behind, and he made no move to tear it down. Instead, he simply offered her a truth. "Out here in the West, ma'am, folks need each other," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "That's the only rule that really matters. The banker needs the rancher needs the blacksmith needs the miner. We're all just spokes in the same wheel. Town doesn't work if the spokes start breaking. Right now, you're a broken spoke. Doesn't mean you're useless. Just means you need a hand to get set right again." His words were nothing like the flowery promises William had written. There was no talk of futures or partnerships, no flattery, no romance. It was a simple, stark philosophy, as unadorned and practical as the man himself. He wasn't offering charity. He was speaking of an ecosystem, a community's need for all its parts to be functional. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived. Her suspicion began to erode, worn down by his plain-spoken sincerity. What kind of work, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The Gilded Nugget needs a hand in the kitchen," he said. "The owner's wife, Sadie. She does the cooking for half the unattached men in town. She's always complaining she's behind on the mending and the peeling. The work ain't refined, but the pay is fair, and it comes with meals." He gestured with his head down the street. "I can take you to her. The choice is yours." The saloon, the rowdiest, most intimidating building in town. The thought of working there, of being surrounded by those rough men, sent a chill of fear through her. It was a world away from the life she had been raised for. But what choice did she have? Starve with her pride intact. She looked from the saloon to Jonas Hale's calm, steady eyes, He wasn't forcing her. He was simply opening a door she hadn't known existed. Taking a shaky breath, she gave a single, decisive nod. All right. He nodded back, as if he'd expected her answer all along. This way, then. He picked up his sack of grain and slung it over his shoulder with an easy strength. He began to walk, and Clara fell into step beside him. The walk to the saloon was another public trial, but this time it was different. She was not alone. The town's stares now fell on the two of them, a new and unexpected pairing. She could feel the intensity of their curiosity, the buzzing of renewed gossip, but Jonas seemed oblivious to it all. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, his presence a silent shield against the prying eyes of the town. He created a small pocket of calm in the middle of the street, and for the first time, Clara felt something other than fear, a fragile, tentative sense of being safe. The Gilded Nugget was loud, even in the middle of the day. As they pushed through the swinging doors, the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and frying bacon washed over them. Jonas led her past the long, polished bar, where a few men were drinking, and through a door at the back that led directly into the kitchen. The kitchen was a hot, chaotic, but surprisingly clean space, dominated by a massive cast-iron stove. A woman with fiery red hair pinned haphazardly on top of her head was wrestling with a large pot, her face flushed with heat and exertion. She looked up as they entered, wiping a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Jonas Hale, what trouble are you bringing me now?" she said, her voice a good-natured rasp. "No trouble. Sadie," Jonas said, setting his sack down. "Brought you a solution. You've been needing an extra pair of hands. This is Miss Bell. She's looking for honest work." Sadie's sharp blue eyes turned to Clara, giving her a swift, thorough appraisal from head to toe. Her gaze was as direct as Mrs. Hanson's, but where the store owner's wife had been full of pity, Sadie's was full of pragmatism. She saw Clara's fine, but dusty, dress, the soft hands that hadn't seen a lifetime of hard labor, and the exhaustion that she couldn't hide. "She looked like she's more suited to a parlor than my kitchen," Sadie stated bluntly. "She says she can cook, clean, and mend," Jonas said, his voice even. "And she looks to me like someone who ain't afraid to get back up after a fall." Sadie looked from Jonas back to Clara, a silent conversation passing between the two women. She saw the desperation in Clara's eyes, but she also saw the steel that Jonas had recognized. "Can you peel a mountain of potatoes without complaint?" Sadie demanded. "Can you scrub a pot till it shines? Can you mend a tear in a pair of denim trousers so it'll hold?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. "I can—" Sadie grunted, a sound of grudging approval. "All right then, we'll try it. $2 a week, and you eat your meals here. You start now. There's a pile of onions in that corner that won't chop themselves." And just like that, it was settled. Jonas gave Clara a final, brief nod. "You'll be all right with Sadie," he said quietly, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the formidable cook in the hot, noisy kitchen. Clara stood for a moment, the heat of the stove on her face, the smell of onions sharp in the air. Sadie pointed to an apron hanging on a hook. "Well, don't just stand there looking pretty. Put that on. This ain't a social call." Clara took the coarse linen apron and tied it around her waist. She picked up a knife and walked over to the crate of onions. The work was humble. Her hands would be stained, her back would ache, and her life would be lived in the back of a saloon. It was a future she could never have imagined. But as she made the first sharp cut into an onion, a tear slipping down her cheek from its sting, she felt not despair, but a profound, grounding sense of relief. This was not a handout. It was a chance. Jonas Hale hadn't offered her pretty promises or easy solutions. He had offered her something far more valuable, a tool, a way to start rebuilding her life, piece by painful, honest piece. The first days in the kitchen of the Gilded Nugget were a trial by fire, both literally and figuratively. The heat from the massive iron stove was a living thing, a constant, oppressive wave that left Clara drenched in sweat within minutes of starting her day. Her life, once governed by the gentle chiming of a mantel clock, was now dictated by the relentless demands of hungry men. Before dawn, she was stoking the fire and grinding coffee. All day, she peeled potatoes, chopped onions, scoured grease-blackened pots, and washed mountains of heavy tin plates in tubs of scalding water. In the evenings, when the saloon was at its loudest, she helped Sadie plate endless platters of steak, beans, and biscuits, the roar from the front room a constant, chaotic backdrop to the sizzle and clang of the kitchen. Her hands, once accustomed to the smooth glide of a pen or the delicate prick of an embroidery needle, were quickly raw, then blistered, then calloused. Her back ached with a deep, permanent weariness. Her fine wool dresses were impractical and ruinous in this environment. Sadie took one look at them and produced 2 faded but sturdy calico work dresses, telling Clara she could pay her back a little each week. The act of shedding her Eastern clothes felt like shedding a final layer of her old self. There was no room for Miss Clara Bell of Philadelphia in this kitchen. Here, she was just Clara, the woman who knew the precise moment to pull the bread from the oven and could scrub a floor with a fierce, desperate energy. Sadie was a demanding boss, her tongue as sharp as the knives she wielded. She corrected Clara's seasoning, criticized the thickness of her potato peels, and tolerated no idleness. But beneath her gruff exterior was a bedrock of fairness. She never asked Clara to do a job she wouldn't do herself. And when Clara, near tears with exhaustion one evening, accidentally burned a batch of biscuits, Sadie simply grunted, scraped them into the slop bucket for the pigs, and said, "Fire's running hot tonight. Watch it closer next time." There was no scolding, no mention of the wasted flour. In Sadie's world, mistakes were part of the work. You learned from them and you moved on. It was a harsher, but in many ways a more honest, form of kindness than any Clara had ever known. Slowly, painfully, Clara found her rhythm. She learned to anticipate the daily ebb and flow of the saloon's hunger, to move with economy and purpose in the cramped kitchen, to sleep so soundly that even the late-night brawls from the front room couldn't wake her. The shame of her rejection by William Prescott did not disappear, but it receded. There was simply no time to dwell on it. Humiliation was a luxury she could not afford when there were 50 pounds of potatoes to be peeled. She was no longer a spectacle of pity. She was a functioning part of the town's machinery, a spoke in the wheel, as Jonas Hale had said. Her mending skills, once a genteel pastime, became a source of extra income. In the quieter afternoon hours, she would sit on a stool by the kitchen's back door, the only place with a decent breeze, and work through a basket of torn shirts, ripped trousers, and detached buttons. The rough denim and canvas felt coarse beneath her fingers. The repairs she made were for durability, not beauty. The men would leave their items with Sadie, along with a few coins, and never speak to Clara directly. But it was another small root she was putting down in this new, hard soil. One sweltering afternoon, as she was patching the knee of a miner's trousers, she noticed 2 small children playing in the dusty alley behind the saloon. They were the blacksmith's children, Eli and Sarah, their faces smudged with dirt and their bare feet tough as leather. They were trying to scratch letters in the dirt with a stick, mimicking the signs they saw around town. But their efforts were a jumble of nonsensical shapes. An idea, the first spark of a purpose beyond simple survival, took hold of Clara. The next day, during her brief lull in the afternoon, she approached them. They were wary at first, unused to attention from anyone outside their family. But Clara's voice was gentle. She had salvaged a few pieces of charcoal from the stove and a smooth, flat piece of discarded wood. "Would you like to learn how to make the letters properly?" she asked, "so you can read the words on the signs?" Curiosity won out over shyness. She sat with them on the ground, the alley her classroom, and began to teach them A, B, C. Their first clumsy attempts to form the letters were a revelation to her. In teaching them, a part of her that had been dormant since her arrival flickered back to life. It was the part of her that loved books, that believed in a world larger than the one you could see. Within a week, the children were waiting for her every afternoon. Soon, another child joined them, then two more. Her small, informal school became a quiet, accepted part of the town's afternoon rhythm. People began to refer to her not just as Sadie's help, but as the teacher. It was during these afternoons that Jonas Hale's visits became a regular occurrence. He never announced his arrival. He would simply appear at the edge of the alley, sometimes leading his horse, sometimes carrying a newly repaired saddle, and lean against the wall of the saloon, watching. He never interrupted the lessons, but the children became aware of his quiet presence, often glancing over to see if he was still there, as if he were a silent guardian of their newfound knowledge. His interactions with Clara were just as understated. He never came to the front door of the saloon. He would appear at the kitchen's back entrance, usually when Clara was there alone, mending or preparing for the evening meal. His reasons were always practical. One day, he would arrive with an armload of perfectly split, dry firewood for the stove, stacking it neatly by the door. "Easier to start the fire with this than that green wood Jed brought you," was all he'd say. Another time, it would be 2 rabbits, cleaned and ready for the pot. "Got an extra," he'd murmur, hanging them from a hook. He never waited for effusive thanks. He would state his purpose, deliver his offering, and then, often, he would linger. He would pull up an overturned crate just outside the doorway and sit. He would take out a piece of leather and begin to mend a strap, or pull out a whetstone and patiently sharpen his knife. The rhythmic shk, 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 a soothing sound in the afternoon quiet. Clara would continue with her mending, her needle dipping in and out of the rough fabric. They rarely spoke more than a few words. "Cooler today," he might observe, glancing at the sky. Yes, she would agree. The wind has turned. Sometimes, lost in the repetitive motion of her sewing, Clara would begin to hum, a soft, almost inaudible tune from a hymn she'd known as a child. She wouldn't even be aware of it until she noticed that the sound of his work had stopped. When she glanced up, she would find him perfectly still, his hands quiet, his head tilted slightly. He would just be listening, his calm gray eyes fixed on some distant point. The moment her humming ceased, he would resume his task as if there had been no interruption. He never commented on it, never complimented her voice, but his quiet, focused attention was more profound than any praise. It made her feel seen, not as a collection of flaws or an object of pity, but as a person whose quietest, most unconscious habits were worthy of notice. Silence became their language. An entire conversation could pass between them without a single word. He would arrive and see the weariness in the slump of her shoulders. And the next morning, a bucket of fresh, clean water from the town's main well would be waiting by the door, saving her the trip. She would see a tear in the cuff of his shirt, and the next time he visited, she would simply hold out her hand for it. He would pass it to her without question, and she would mend it while he waited. The only sounds, the whisper of the needle through the cloth and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. He would take it back with a simple nod of thanks, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, electric moment. In these quiet interludes, Clara began to piece together a picture of him. He worked for one of the larger ranches north of town, but he seemed to be his own man, taking jobs as they came. He was a man of immense competence. Every tool he used, from his knife to his lariat, was perfectly maintained. He moved with a purpose that wasted no energy. He was observant, missing nothing. But he was not a gossip. He seemed to exist at a slight angle to the rest of the town, a part of it but not consumed by it. He was a still point in her chaotic new world. One evening, after an especially grueling day, Clara stepped out the back door to catch a breath of the cooling air. The sky was a riot of stars, more than she had ever seen in the hazy skies of the east. Jonas was there, leaning against the corral fence, smoking a thin, hand-rolled cigarette. The tip glowed red in the darkness. He had been there for some time, she realized, just waiting. Long day, he stated quietly. "They're all long days," she replied, her voice rough with fatigue. She leaned against the rough plank wall of the kitchen, a few feet from him. They stood in a comfortable silence for several minutes, looking up at the vast, spangled darkness. "Back east," Clara said, her voice soft. "You can't see the sky like this. There's always a glow from the city. You forget how many stars there are." "They're always there," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Folks just forget to look up." He took a final draw from his cigarette and flicked it into the dust, where it died in a shower of tiny sparks. "You've made a place for yourself here, Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded natural, right, and his words, a simple statement of fact, landed in her heart with more force than any of William Prescott's elaborate compliments. He wasn't flattering her. He was acknowledging her struggle, her grit, her survival. "I'm just doing what I have to," she said. "That's what making a place is," he replied. He pushed himself off the fence. "Get some rest." He gave a slight nod and disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps making no sound. Clara remained, looking up at the endless stars, a place for herself. She looked down at her hands, bathed in the faint moonlight. They were rough, stained, and starting to scar in new ways. They were the hands of a survivor, and for the first time, she looked at them and felt a quiet, profound sense of pride. The life she was living was hard, but it was honest, and it was hers. Months bled into one another, turning the raw, brutal newness of redemption into a familiar, wearying routine. Summer's oppressive heat finally broke, yielding to the crisp, golden days of early autumn. The dust settled a little easier. The wind lost its scorching bite, and a current of anticipation began to stir through the town. It was time for the annual Founders' Day gathering, a tradition that was less about founding anything and more about providing a sanctioned outlet for a year's worth of pent-up energy. For a week, the town was transformed. Wagons and buckboards, laden with families from outlying ranches, kicked up a constant cloud of dust on the main street. Makeshift stalls were erected, selling everything from potent, home-brewed liquor to hand-carved wooden toys. A dusty patch of land at the edge of town was cordoned off with rough fencing to create an arena for the day's main events: horse races and bull riding. The sounds of hammering, laughter, and the tuning of a fiddle replaced the solitary clang of the blacksmith's anvil. For Clara, the festive air was a source of deep unease. For months, she had found a strange sort of safety in her routine, in the predictable anonymity of her work. Her world was the kitchen, the boarding house, and the small patch of alley where she taught her pupils. It was a small, contained life, but it was one she had built and could control. The fair threatened to shatter that containment. It was a public affair, a stage upon which the entire town would perform its prescribed social roles, and she knew her own role all too well: the outcast, the subject of gossip, the woman who wasn't good enough. "You're going, Sadie announced 2 days before the event, slamming a sack of flour onto the work table with a percussive thud. It wasn't a question. "I have too much to do here," Clara protested weakly, kneading a massive ball of dough. "With all these extra people in town, the kitchen will be busier than ever." "Nonsense," Sadie scoffed, her hands on her hips. "The bulk of the cooking is done the day before. The day of, it's just roasting meat over the pit outside and keeping the drinks flowing. I can handle it. You, girl, look like you need to see the sun for something other than drying laundry." She eyed Clara's faded calico work dress. "You can't wear that, though. You'll look like a scullery maid." A familiar pang of shame hit Clara. She had nothing else, nothing suitable for a celebration. That evening, back in her small room, she pulled out the wooden trunk that had sat in the corner since her arrival. At the very bottom, wrapped in protective linen, was the last of her fine Eastern dresses. It was a deep forest green, the color of the mossy woods of her home state, made of a soft, durable wool. It was simple, unadorned with the ruffles and lace that were fashionable. But it was a dress of quality, a reminder of a life when she had been something other than Sadie's kitchen help. She spent the next 2 evenings by the faint light of her oil lamp, carefully altering it. She let out the seams a little. The hard work had added a layer of muscle to her arms and shoulders. She reinforced a worn patch at the elbow with tiny, invisible stitches. It was an act of reclamation, of taking a piece of her past and making it fit her present. When the day of the fair arrived, Clara dressed with a sense of trepidation. The green dress felt strange against her skin, a whisper of a life she no longer lived. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The sun and heat had added a light tan to her skin, and her hair, though pulled back simply, had a healthier shine. The dress, with its modest neckline and plain, elegant cut, made her stand out from the faded prints and rough-spun fabrics that were the uniform of the frontier women. And her scar, the silver line on her cheek, seemed less a flaw and more a part of the landscape of her face. For a fleeting moment, she saw not a rejected woman, but simply herself. She walked into the heart of the fair alone. The noise was a cheerful assault on the senses. A fiddler sawed away on a makeshift stage, the tune scratchy but full of a wild, joyful energy. The air was thick with the smell of roasting beef and the sweet, cloying scent of molasses candy. Men shouted encouragement at a shooting gallery, the crack of the pistol shots punctuating the music. She saw her pupils, the blacksmith's children, their faces sticky with candy, and they waved to her with a shy excitement that warmed her heart. But she also saw the other side of the festivities. She saw the men, already drunk, stumbling out of the saloon. She saw the hard-faced gamblers running games of chance where no one ever seemed to win. And she saw the women, gathered in small, tight circles, their eyes missing nothing, their low-murmured conversations stopping whenever Clara drew near. She saw Mrs. Hanson, the store owner's wife, offer a polite but cool nod. She saw the looks that passed between them, looks of pity mixed with a certain smug satisfaction. And then she saw William Prescott. He was standing near the makeshift arena, the center of a group of well-dressed men, undoubtedly the same investors from the land office. He was a portrait of success, laughing and gesturing expansively. He caught her eye from across the dusty square. For a moment, his smile faltered. He looked at her in the green dress, a flicker of something surprised regret in his eyes, before he turned pointedly back to his companions. The cut was as sharp and as public as his first rejection. Clara's fragile confidence wavered. She felt a desperate urge to flee back to the safety of the kitchen. She was an intruder here. She didn't belong. She turned to leave, to retreat to the shadows where she felt she was supposed to be. "Clara!" Jonas Hale stood before her. Like her, he seemed both a part of the scene and separate from it. He was cleaner than she'd ever seen him. His jaw was smoothly shaven, highlighting the lean strength of his face. He wore a dark blue shirt, faded but neatly pressed, and he held his hat in his hands instead of on his head. He seemed taller, more solid, out here in the open. His calm gray eyes met hers, and in their quiet depths, she saw a question. He took in her dress, the tension in her shoulders, the way she had been about to turn away. He looked over at the fiddler, who was just starting up a new, slower tune, a waltz. He shifted his weight, a rare sign of uncertainty. The confident, competent man who could mend any strap and calm any horse seemed, for a moment, at a loss. He cleared his throat. "They're playing a waltz," he said, his voice low. Meant only for her. It wasn't a charming invitation. It was a simple statement of fact and an offer. Clara's breath caught. To dance, here, in the middle of the town square, was an act of shocking intimacy. It was a public declaration. It was everything she had been trying to avoid. But to refuse would be to accept the town's judgment, to agree that she was unworthy of even this small, simple pleasure. It would be a betrayal of the quiet understanding that had grown between them in the back alley. She looked into his steady, waiting eyes and gave a small nod. "I know." A barely perceptible relaxing of his shoulders was his only reply. He held out his hand. His palm was calloused and warm as she placed her hand in his. He led her to a cleared space where a few other couples were beginning to circle. The moment he put his other hand on her back and drew her into the rhythm of the dance, the noise and the stares of the crowd faded to a dull, distant roar. She had expected him to be awkward, but he was not. He moved with the same quiet, efficient grace he brought to every other task. His lead was firm, sure, guiding her effortlessly through the steps. All the uncertainty he'd shown in asking was gone, replaced by a solid, reassuring confidence. She was acutely aware of him, the rough texture of his shirt beneath her hand, the clean, sun and soap scent of him, the way his calm gaze was fixed on her, not on the crowd, in the circle of his arms. She felt, for the first time in a long time, utterly safe. It was a fragile, fleeting bubble of peace in the midst of the chaos. But the bubble was destined to burst. As they turned, she caught a glimpse of two women standing near the edge of the dance area. They were the wives of prominent ranchers, women who had never spoken a word to her, but whose disapproving glances had followed her for months. One leaned toward the other, her hand cupped to her mouth, but her voice carried on the wind, sharp and clear. "Look at that, a jilted woman and a futureless cowboy. I suppose they deserve each other." The words were a physical blow. Clara flinched, her body stiffening in his arms. The rhythm of her steps faltered. The shame she had fought so hard to keep at bay came rushing back, hot and acidic. The women were right. What was she but a woman publicly scorned, and what was he but a hired hand with no land, no prospects, no name? They were two broken spokes, clinging to each other. She expected Jonas to drop his hands, to step away. His face flushed with the embarrassment of being associated with her. He felt her falter. He felt her stiffen. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing along the hard line of it. He did not look at the women. His gaze remained on Clara's face, but it hardened, becoming as cool and impenetrable as river stone. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't need to. Instead, his hand, the one holding hers, tightened its grip. It was not a painful pressure, but a firm, possessive, and deeply protective one. His other hand, resting on the small of her back, pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, closing the small space that her shock had created. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was a definitive, unambiguous answer. It was a shield, forged in an instant, against the poisoned darts of the town's gossip. He continued to lead her through the final notes of the waltz as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. The dance was no longer just a dance. It was a choice, a public alignment. He had not been shamed by her past, and he would not let her be shamed by it now. He had, without a single word, stood with her. When the music stopped, he held her hand for a moment longer than was proper. He looked down at her, and the hardness in his eyes softened. He saw the turmoil in her face, the sting of the insult warring with a new, dawning gratitude. "Let's walk," he said quietly. He kept her hand in his as he led her away from the music and the dancers, away from the center of the town's attention. He didn't look back. The whispers and the stares were still there, but for the first time, Clara felt they had no power to harm her. They were just noise. The only thing that felt real was the warm, calloused strength of the hand that held hers, a silent vow that was stronger than any pretty words she had ever heard. The dance at the Founders' Day gathering shifted the subtle, unspoken currents of redemption. The quiet, back-alley understanding between Clara and Jonas had been brought into the full, harsh light of public scrutiny and, in surviving it, had solidified into something new. There were still whispers, but their tone had changed. The scorn had largely been replaced by a grudging curiosity. They were no longer just a jilted woman and a drifter. They were Clara and Jonas, a pairing as unexpected and yet as strangely fitting as a desert flower blooming after a rare rain. Their own interactions took on a new, quiet confidence. He still came to the back of the saloon, his visits practical and his words few, but the silence between them was now imbued with a shared memory. He would meet her gaze from across the street, and the slight nod he gave was no longer just a greeting, but an affirmation. She found herself humming more as she worked. The small, hopeful tunes, a reflection of a heart that was, against all odds, beginning to feel secure. The fragile peace she had built for herself no longer felt quite so fragile. It felt shared. This delicate equilibrium was shattered on a Tuesday. They rode in from the east, 4 of them, emerging from the shimmering heat haze like wraiths. They were different from the usual cowboys or prospectors who passed through. Their clothes were worn not from honest work, but from hard riding and long neglect. Their eyes were colder, their faces harder, and they carried their guns with a predatory ease that set every nerve in town on edge. They moved as a unit, a pack, and at their head was a man with a cruel slash of a mouth and pale, dead eyes. They dismounted in front of the Gilded Nugget, their movement slow and arrogant, and pushed their way into the saloon. A nervous silence fell over the town. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations. Women pulled their children indoors. It was as if a hawk had just cast its shadow over a chicken yard. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the sudden hush from the front room. Sadie, who had been peering through the kitchen door, quickly pulled back, her face grim. "Trouble," she muttered, wiping her hands on her apron. "The bad kind." Later that day, Jonas appeared at the back door. He wasn't carrying firewood or game. He was just there, his body taut with a stillness Clara had never seen in him before. It wasn't his usual calm. It was the tense, coiled immobility of a man expecting a fight. "You've seen them," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, his gray eyes fixed on the street beyond the alley. "I have." "Who are they?" "The man in the lead is named Silas Kane," Jonas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He and I rode together, a long time ago, before I learned the difference between taking what you want and earning what you need." The simple confession hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. He had a past, a darkness she had never considered. The quiet, honorable man she knew had once been something else, someone who rode with men like Silas Kane. "He's a bad man. Clara," Jonas continued, finally looking at her. The warning in his eyes was stark. "He lives on the fear of others. He and his men will stay until they've taken all this town has to offer, one way or another. Keep to the kitchen. Stay off the street as much as you can." His warning proved prophetic. The next few days were a slow-burning fuse. Kane and his men did not launch an immediate assault. Instead, they began to strangle the town with fear. They drank from morning till night in the saloon, their presence driving out the regular customers. Their laughter was loud and mocking. They started arguments over card games, their hands hovering near their pistols until the other player backed down. They took provisions from the general store, promising to pay later with a smile that was more of a threat. Mr. Hanson, the store owner, could do nothing but watch, his face pale with impotent rage. The town held its breath. The sheriff, an aging man named Cobb, who was more adept at handling Saturday night drunks than hardened outlaws, was clearly intimidated. He spoke to Kane once, a brief, tense conversation that ended with the sheriff retreating, his face grim. Redemption was on its own. Clara felt the fear like a physical chill. The children stopped coming for their lessons. The back alley, once her sanctuary, now felt exposed and dangerous. Her world shrank again, this time to the 4 walls of the kitchen, which felt less like a workplace and more like a besieged fortress. Through it all, Jonas was a constant, watchful presence. He no longer went out to the ranch to work. He stayed in town, never far from the main street, his eyes always on Kane and his men. He was a silent, one-man patrol, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the town's growing panic. The flashpoint came on the third day. It was late afternoon, and a tense quiet had settled over the street. Clara was rolling out dough when she heard a shout from the front of the saloon, followed by the sound of a woman's sharp cry of protest. It was Sarah, the blacksmith's young wife, who had come to the saloon to fetch her husband for supper. One of Kane's men had grabbed her arm as she tried to pass, making a coarse remark. What happened next was a blur of chaos. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Cooper, roared with fury and charged out of the saloon. But before he could reach the man who had accosted his wife, Silas Kane stepped in his way, drawing his pistol with lightning speed. The street went dead silent. "That's far enough, blacksmith," Kane said, his voice dangerously soft. "Your wife should learn some manners, and so should you." From the kitchen doorway, Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The violence was about to erupt. And then Jonas was there. He hadn't charged. He had simply stepped out from the covered walkway of the general store, placing himself between Kane and the blacksmith. He didn't have his gun drawn. His hands were open at his sides. "Let him go, Silas," Jonas said, his voice low and even, yet it carried across the entire street. "This isn't your town." Kane's cruel mouth twisted into a smile. "Jonas Hale, I wondered when you'd stop lurking in the shadows and come out to play. Still trying to be the hero, I seem to recall it never ended well for you." He gestured with his pistol. "This town is whatever I say it is. And right now, it's my personal bank. Step aside." "No," Jonas said simply. The word was a spark in a powder keg. Kane's smile vanished. So be it. The world exploded in a deafening roar. It wasn't like the crack of a pistol at the fair. It was a deep, violent concussion that vibrated through the ground. Kane fired. Jonas, already in motion, dove to the side, his own pistol seeming to leap into his hand. He fired from the ground, the shot going wide but forcing Kane's men to scatter for cover. The blacksmith shoved his wife to the ground behind a water trough and scrambled for the shotgun he kept in his wagon. Gunfire erupted from all sides. It was a chaotic, terrifying symphony of noise, smoke, and splintering wood. Men were shouting, horses were screaming, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Clara was frozen in the doorway, her mind unable to process the sheer speed and violence of it. Jonas was using a barrel for cover, firing with a calm, deadly precision that was terrifying to behold. He was not the quiet, gentle man who listened to her hum. He was a warrior, his face a mask of concentration. One of Kane's men cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Another fired wildly, the bullet thudding into the wall just inches from Clara's head. The impact snapped her out of her trance. She saw Jonas glance toward her, his face a flash of fear for her safety. And in that split second of distraction, Silas Kane took his shot. Jonas cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and staggered back, clutching his right shoulder. His pistol fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers into the dust. Seeing Jonas hit, the blacksmith roared and unleashed a blast from his shotgun. The spray of pellets sent two of Kane's men reeling back in pain and surprise. Kane, seeing his advantage lost and not wanting to face a determined man with a shotgun, made his decision. "Let's ride," he yelled. He fired one last, angry shot in Jonas's direction before he and his remaining men mounted their horses and galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in their wake. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was as shocking as the noise had been. Then, Clara ran. She didn't think. She didn't feel the fear. All she saw was Jonas, slumped against the wall of the general store, his face pale, a dark, ugly stain spreading across his blue shirt. She fell to her knees beside him in the dust. "Jonas," she breathed, her hand hovering over the wound, afraid to touch him. His gray eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. "Clara," he gasped. "You're all right." "Never mind me," she said, her voice shaking, but her mind suddenly, fiercely clear. "Help me!" she shouted to the stunned townspeople who were beginning to emerge from their cover. "Somebody, help me get him inside." The blacksmith was there in an instant, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he and another man lifted Jonas. They carried him not to the doctor's office, which was at the other end of town, but to the closest, cleanest place Clara could think of, her own small room at the boarding house. The next hours were a waking nightmare. Mrs. Gable, her earlier coolness forgotten in the crisis, brought stacks of clean linens and buckets of hot water. Sadie arrived with whiskey for the pain and a grimly practical look on her face. But it was Clara who took charge. She cut away the blood-soaked shirt with a pair of sewing shears. She washed the wound, her stomach churning at the sight of torn flesh and muscle. The bullet was still in him, lodged deep in the muscle of his shoulder. "It has to come out," Sadie said, her voice low. Clara looked at Jonas, who was biting down on a strip of leather to keep from crying out, his body slick with sweat. She took a deep, steadying breath. She sterilized her father's old pocket knife, the one she kept for sharpening charcoal for her students. In the flame of the lamp, her hands, which had once trembled to accept a handkerchief from this man, were now rock steady as she probed the wound. Time seemed to stop. The only sounds were Jonas's ragged breathing and her own quiet instructions to Sadie. Finally! She felt the metallic click of the knife against the lead. With a final, agonizing movement, she pried the misshapen bullet free. She spent the rest of the night stitching the wound closed with her own sewing needle and fine silk thread, her mending skills put to their most gruesome and vital test. She bandaged him tightly, her movements efficient and sure. The town had seen him defend them. Now, in the lamplight of her small room, they saw her defend him. Word of what had happened, and of her role in it, spread through redemption like a wildfire. The gossip had found a new, definitive narrative. It was no longer about a jilted woman and a lonely cowboy. The story was now of the quiet man who had faced down Silas Kane for them, and the quiet woman who had, with her own hands, saved his life. The whispers on the street now held a different tone, one of respect and finality. "Did you hear she pulled the bullet out herself?" Never left his side. "They're bound together now, for certain." Clara heard none of it. She sat in the single chair by his bedside, wiping his feverish brow with a cool, damp cloth. The danger was over, for now, but as she watched his chest rise and fall with each pained breath, she knew that something irreversible had happened. Her heart, which she had guarded so fiercely, had made its final stand. She had run toward the gunfire for him. She had faced the blood and the pain for him. The quiet, hesitant affection had been burned away in the crisis, leaving behind something harder, fiercer, and as undeniable as the scar on her own face. It was love, in its most raw and powerful form. And as she kept her vigil through the long, dark night, she knew she would do anything to protect it. The days that followed the shootout blurred into a single, extended moment of tense and quiet vigilance. Clara's world shrank to the four walls of her small room, a space that now held the scent of antiseptic, whiskey, and the faint, metallic smell of blood. Life became a series of small, essential rituals, changing Jonas's bandages, cooling his fevered skin with damp cloths, coaxing spoonfuls of broth from Sadie between his pale, cracked lips. The boarding house fell into a hushed reverence. Mrs. Gable left stacks of clean linens outside the door without knocking, and the other boarders tiptoed down the hall, their usual gruff noises silenced by the gravity of what lay behind the closed door. Jonas drifted in and out of consciousness. In his delirium, he spoke names she didn't know, saw landscapes she couldn't imagine. He would sometimes thrash in the grip of a nightmare, his good arm flailing, and she would soothe him, her voice a low, steady murmur, her hand resting on his uninjured arm until the storm passed. In his more lucid moments, his gray eyes, clouded with pain, would find hers. He wouldn't speak. He would simply watch her as she moved about the room, a profound, questioning vulnerability in his gaze. She was his anchor in a sea of pain, and she refused to let him drift away. She was exhausted, her body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. But she did not falter. The work was a grim sort of penance and a fierce act of devotion all at once. Every clean bandage she wrapped was a testament. Every spoonful of water she gave was a prayer. This was not the passive, hopeful love she had imagined in her youth. This was a raw, functional, and ferociously protective love, born in a dusty street and tempered in the crucible of violence and fear. It was the only kind of love that could possibly survive a place like Redemption. On the fourth night, the fever broke. Clara had dozed off in the chair, her head resting on the edge of his bed, and she woke to the feel of a hand gently touching her hair. She sat up with a start. Jonas was awake, truly awake. The delirium was gone from his eyes, leaving them clear and startlingly intense in the pale moonlight that streamed through the window. His skin was cool to the touch. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "You're back," she breathed, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her. She quickly poured him a glass of water, holding it to his lips as he drank. He sank back against the pillows, his gaze never leaving her face. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," she said, her voice soft. He was quiet for a long time after that, simply watching her. The silence in the room was deep and profound, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind outside. The town was asleep. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. "I had a wife once," he said, his voice so quiet she had to lean closer to hear. The words were stark, unexpected, and landed in the quiet room with the weight of a stone. Clara said nothing. She simply waited, knowing that this was a story he had to tell in his own time, in his own way. Her name was Mary. He continued, his eyes fixed on the moonlit ceiling, seeing a past she could only imagine. "We had a small piece of land in the hill country of Texas. Wasn't much, but it was ours. We were young, thought we had all the time in the world." He swallowed, a difficult, painful motion. She was like a spring morning. Everything about her was bright and full of life. He fell silent again, and Clara could feel the chasm of years and grief that separated the man beside her from the young man in that story. "We were going to have a child," he said, the words barely audible. The winter was hard. A fever came through. It took them both in the space of 3 days. His voice was utterly flat, stripped of all emotion. A landscape scoured clean by an old and terrible fire. I buried them myself, on a hill overlooking the creek. I made promises to her. You see, a lifetime of them. Promised I'd keep her safe, promised her a house with a proper porch, promised her a whole passel of children. He finally turned his head on the pillow, his clear gray eyes meeting hers in the darkness. The pain in them was a raw, physical thing. Every promise I made, I broke. They're just words. Clara, words you throw at the sky, hoping they'll stick, but they don't. They just fall back down to earth and break your heart. After I lost her, I swore I'd never make another promise to anyone. Never again would I be the reason for someone else's hopes. It's better to be alone, safer. His confession explained everything, his solitary nature, his reluctance to get involved, the sad, knowing calm in his eyes. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of broken promises. He had built a fortress of solitude around his heart, not to keep others out, but to keep his own capacity for failure and grief locked safely inside. A profound sorrow for him washed over Clara, so deep it ached. His fear of promising was the other side of her own fear, the fear of believing. She thought of William Prescott's letters, each one a beautifully crafted promise, each one a lie. She thought of the humiliation, the feeling of being discarded like an inconvenient piece of luggage. Her pain was fresh and sharp, while his was an old, weathered wound. But they were born of the same fundamental betrayal of hope. "I came here," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Because of promises made in letters by a man I had never met. He promised a home, a future, a partnership. I believed him. I packed my life into a single trunk and traveled halfway across the country because I was foolish enough to believe in his words. She looked down at her hands, clasped in her lap. When he finally saw me, he told me I was an error in judgment. I didn't fit his picture. The promises, they were never real. They were just bait in a trap. I learned that day that a woman can be abandoned just as easily with a polite apology as with a slammed door. She raised her eyes to his. "So you see," she whispered, "I am just as afraid as you are. You're afraid to make a promise, and I am terrified to ever believe in one again." Their twin fears lay exposed between them in the moonlit silence. He, the man who believed his love brought ruin, and she, the woman who believed she was unworthy of being loved. It was an impossible chasm, a desolate no-man's land of past hurts and future fears. The silence stretched, thick with everything that had happened and everything that could never be. This quiet room, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, trapping them with their own ghosts. This bond between them, forged in shared glances and a bloody shootout, seemed destined to break apart on the jagged rocks of their pasts. Clara felt a tear trace a path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. It was a tear for him, for his Mary, for herself, for the cruel way life taught you to stop hoping. She looked around the small, cramped room, the iron bedstead, the wash basin, her mended green dress hanging on a hook on the door. This small space had become the whole of her world. His presence, even in pain and fever, had filled it, had made it feel like a home in a way no proper house ever had. The thought of losing this, of him healing and riding away to protect his solitary heart, was more than she could bear. She had to know. She had to ask the question that mattered more than any other. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sleeping, moon-drenched town. "This," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "this feeling, this room, you and I, here, like this, the way you stood for me at the dance, the way you faced Silas Kane, the way I feel when you are near." She turned back to face him, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. Her heart was hammering, but her resolve was firm. She asked, "Will this stay ours?" The question was everything. It was not a demand for a future he couldn't guarantee. It was a plea for the present, for the truth of the fragile, powerful thing that existed between them. Jonas pushed himself up slightly, his good arm taking his weight. The movement was a clear effort, and it cost him, but he held her gaze, his eyes searching hers in the half-light. She saw the war within him, the deep, ingrained fear battling with a powerful, undeniable truth. He could offer her no guarantees against fevers or floods or the simple, cruel turns of fate. He could not promise her a long life or a house with a porch or a future free of pain. He knew the folly of such words. But he could promise something else. He could promise his own heart. Here, now. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough, a vow torn from the deepest part of his soul. "If you want it," the cowboy vowed. It was not the promise of a poet or a politician. It was the promise of a survivor. It was simple, absolute, and utterly honest. It held no illusions about the future, but it was a rock-solid commitment to the present, and it placed the final, most important choice in her hands. He would not trap her with his hopes. He was inviting her to build them with him. The tears that had been welling in her eyes finally spilled over, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a profound, soul-deep release, the fortress around her own heart, built of shame and fear of abandonment, crumbled to dust. He was not William Prescott. He would not discard her. He was Jonas Hale, a man who understood the cost of a promise and had just made the only one that mattered. And she stepped closer. Jonas healed slowly, with the stubborn patience of a man accustomed to the body's betrayals. The deep, searing pain in his shoulder gradually subsided into a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder of the violence that had brought him and Clara together. He moved out of her small room at the boarding house as soon as he could stand on his own, taking a room in the livery stable. It was a move dictated by propriety, but it changed nothing of the essential truth between them. They were a unit now, their lives intertwined in a way that the whole town saw and, for the most part, had come to respect. Their days settled into a new kind of rhythm, a quiet dance of shared existence. Clara continued her work in the kitchen and her lessons in the alley, but her labor was no longer fueled by the frantic energy of survival. It was now the steady work of building a life. Jonas took on odd jobs around town, mending fences, breaking a difficult horse, helping the blacksmith with a heavy forge, choosing tasks that kept him close, his strength a quiet, protective presence on the periphery of her days. In the evenings, they would often sit on the bench outside the boarding house, the comfortable silence between them a language richer than any words. He would watch her hands as she mended a shirt under the lantern light, and she would find her gaze drawn to the hard, clean lines of his profile against the darkening sky. They were two solitary people who had, against all odds, found their center in each other. But the peace that had settled over redemption was a fragile thing, like a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. The shadow of Silas Kane was gone, but another, more insidious one was beginning to lengthen. It came not in the form of outlaws with guns, but in the guise of progress, wielded by a man with a checkbook and a vision, William Prescott. Having been thwarted in his land negotiations by the chaos of the shootout, William had returned from a trip east with renewed purpose and the backing of his wealthy investors. His ambition was no longer just to sell plots of land. It was to reshape redemption in his own image. He spoke of a new hotel, a bank, a direct spur from the coming railroad. He spoke of bylaws and town councils, of order and profit. To the town's more ambitious merchants, his words were a siren song of prosperity. But to those like Cooper the blacksmith, Sadie, and the small ranchers who valued their independence, his vision felt like a gilded cage. William's new and improved redemption had no room for unruly, unpredictable elements. And in his eyes, no one was more unpredictable than Jonas Hale. He saw Jonas not as the man who had saved the town, but as a dangerous relic of the lawless past he was trying to erase. A man with a gun and a history, a man who answered to no one, was a threat to the kind of orderly, controlled society William intended to build. And Clara, the woman who had defied him and bound herself to this man, was a living symbol of that defiance. William understood that a direct confrontation with Jonas would be foolish and messy. Instead, he chose a more civilized weapon. He came to Clara one late afternoon, finding her alone as she packed away the charcoal and slate boards after her last lesson. He did not approach with the stiff formality of his previous visit, but with a carefully crafted expression of concern and regret. "Miss Bell, Clara," he began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "May I have a moment? I've come to believe our last conversation was unsatisfactory. I was a man under pressure, and I spoke poorly." Clara regarded him with a cool, wary stillness. "I recall your meaning being quite clear, Mr. Prescott." "Perhaps," he conceded with a disarming nod. "But my concern was genuine, if clumsily expressed, and it has only grown since the incident with Kane." He gestured vaguely toward the main street. "This is a violent, unpredictable place. You have seen that firsthand. You have been forced to endure things no decent woman should ever have to witness." He took a step closer, his tone becoming confidential, almost brotherly. "Jonas Hale is a brave man. No one can deny that. He did the town a service. But men like him, they draw violence to them like moths to a flame. His past is a ghost that will always be at his shoulder. Do you truly believe this is a life for you, looking over your shoulder, waiting for the next Silas Kane to ride into town mending bullet wounds in your own bedroom?" Clara's hands tightened on the slate board she was holding. She said nothing, her silence a wall he could not breach. "I have been thinking a great deal about my error in bringing you here," he continued, his voice laced with sincerity. "I feel a certain responsibility for your welfare. My investors and I are financing a regular, comfortable stagecoach route back to St. Louis. I have taken the liberty of securing a ticket for you, and I have prepared a bank draft." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Enough for you to establish yourself, to find a respectable position, perhaps even to return to Pennsylvania if you wish. Think of it not as charity, but as an apology, a chance to have the life of peace and security you deserve, a life away from all this." It was a masterful temptation. He offered not just an escape, but a restoration. He was offering her a path back to the woman she once was, a life free from the smell of bacon grease and gunpowder, a life where her hands could be soft again. He was offering her safety. All she had to do was leave. All she had to do was abandon Jonas. Clara looked at the paper in his hand, then at his handsome, earnest face. She saw him not as a savior, but as a man who could not comprehend a currency other than money and power. He could not understand that her security was not something that could be purchased. "You are mistaken, Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a profound, unshakable certainty. "My life here is hard, and it is, at times, dangerous. I have no illusions about that, but for the first time since I was a child, I am not afraid." He looked at her, confused. "Not afraid after what you've been through?" "What I have is not a life free from danger," she explained, her gaze direct and clear. "It is a life where I know I will not have to face that danger alone. The strength I have found here did not come from a lack of hardship. It came from learning how to endure it. The safety you offer is an illusion. It is the safety of a gilded cage. I prefer the freedom of the wilderness, even with its wolves." She looked past him, her gaze finding the distant figure of Jonas mending a harness outside the livery. "My place is here." She had made her choice. She had not chosen a life of ease. She had chosen him. She had chosen a love that was not a shelter from the storm, but an anchor within it. This, she knew, was a strength William Prescott would never understand. His face hardened, the mask of concern falling away to reveal the cold, pragmatic core beneath. "I see," he said, his voice clipped. "You have made your choice. I hope you do not live to regret it." He pocketed the bank draft and turned away without another word. His threat was not idle. Having failed to remove what he perceived as Jonas's weakness, he moved on Jonas's strength, his standing in the community. William and his investors began buying up outstanding loans and land claims. They used complicated legal language and Eastern lawyers to challenge the deeds of the town's original settlers. Cooper the blacksmith was served with a notice claiming his forge was built on land that was part of a larger, older railroad grant now owned by William's company. Sadie received a similar notice, challenging her right to the saloon property. It was a bloodless, legal siege, designed to starve out and evict the very people who had stood against Silas Kane. The final confrontation came a week later. William, flanked by Sheriff Cobb and two grim-faced men wearing official-looking badges he had paid for, stood in front of the Land and Assay office. He held a sheaf of eviction notices. A small crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of anger and fear. "These are legal, binding documents," William announced, his voice carrying across the tense square. "This is about the rule of law. It is about the future of this town. Those who stand in the way of progress will be removed." He looked directly at Jonas, who stood in the middle of the street, alone. "And those who have no legal claim here, no property, no stake but a history of violence, they have no say at all. You would be wise to ride out. Hail, there is nothing for you here." Jonas did not move. He stood, his feet planted in the dust, his hands loose at his sides. He was calm, but it was the calm of a coming storm. "This town is more than deeds and property lines, Prescott," Jonas said, his voice low but clear. "It's people, and you don't own them. "That is where you are wrong," William sneered. "In the end, everyone has a price." He gestured to Sheriff Cobb. "Serve the notice to the blacksmith." But as the sheriff took a reluctant step forward, a heavy clang echoed through the square. Cooper the blacksmith stepped out of his forge, a heavy smithing hammer held loosely in one massive hand. He walked into the street and stood beside Jonas. Then the swinging doors of the saloon burst open. Sadie emerged, an old, formidable-looking shotgun cradled in her arms. She walked to Jonas's other side, Mr. and Mrs. Hanson came out of the general store and stood behind them. A few of the miners and 2 of the ranchers whose land bordered the town followed, their faces grim, their hands resting on the pistols at their belts. And then Clara walked out of the boarding house. She wore her simple calico dress. Her hands were empty, and her face was calm. She walked directly to Jonas's side, her shoulder brushing against his uninjured one. She did not look at William. She looked only at Jonas, her presence a silent, unwavering declaration. William stared at the assembled line of defiance. He had expected to face one man. Instead, he was facing the stubborn, beating heart of redemption. He had tried to buy their loyalty, to intimidate them with the law, but he had failed to understand what bound them together. It wasn't money or legal papers. It was a shared history of hardship, a web of quiet obligations, and the fierce, protective loyalty that had been forged in the face of Silas Kane's guns. He had offered them prosperity, but they had chosen community. His face paled with a mixture of fury and impotence. His hired badges and his aging sheriff were no match for this. To press the issue would mean a bloodbath, one that his investors would not tolerate. His civilized war had been met with a frontier spirit he could not break. He looked at Jonas, and then at Clara standing beside him, her small frame radiating a strength that baffled and infuriated him. He had seen her as a pawn, a weakness. He saw now that she was the linchpin, the quiet center around which their resistance had formed. Without another word, William Prescott turned, crumpled the eviction notices in his fist, and strode back into his office. Slamming the door behind him, the confrontation was over. No shots had been fired, but a decisive battle for the soul of the town had been fought and won, right there in the dusty street. Jonas had not fought alone. He was a part of something larger now. And as he looked at Clara, at the unwavering strength in her eyes, he knew that the most important promise he had ever made was already being kept. The standoff in the street did not end with a bang, but with a slow, collective exhalation of breath. William Prescott's retreat back into his office was a quiet, definitive defeat. He had tried to conquer redemption with law and money, but the town had answered with hammers, shotguns, and an unwavering line of solidarity. In the days that followed, a subtle but profound shift occurred. Prescott's grand vision for a polished, profitable town dissolved. He remained a diminished figure managing his land claims, but the aura of his authority was gone. He was no longer the town's ambitious architect. He was just a man in an office, a reminder of a future that redemption had quietly, stubbornly refused. Life, which had been held in a state of suspended animation, resumed its steady, demanding rhythm. For Jonas, the path to full recovery was a lesson in patience. The wound on his shoulder healed cleanly, the neat line of Clara's stitches a testament to her steady hand. But the muscle beneath was a knot of protest. For a man whose life was defined by physical competence, the inability to easily lift a saddle or swing an axe was a frustrating, humbling reality. Yet he bore it with a stoic grace. He took on lighter work, his movements careful and deliberate, and in the evenings, Clara would gently massage the aching muscles, her touch both a soothing balm and a silent acknowledgement of the price he had paid. Clara's own life had found its unshakable footing. She was no longer a subject of speculation. She was a fixture, a vital part of the town's ecosystem. The saloon kitchen was still hot and demanding, but she moved within it with an easy confidence. her relationship with Sadie having evolved from that of an employer and employee to a partnership of mutual, unspoken respect. Her afternoon school in the alley had grown. Cooper the blacksmith built a rough-hewn bench for the children, and even Mrs. Hanson donated a box of slightly damaged slate boards. She was the teacher now, a title that held more weight and brought her a deeper satisfaction than any social standing she had once coveted back east. The question of their future was not decided in a moment of grand passion or with a formal proposal. It grew organically, a logical and necessary next step in the life they were already living. It began one afternoon when Jonas returned from a walk to the low hills that bordered the town. "There's a piece of land," he said, finding her as she swept the kitchen floor. "Just past the creek. It's on a small rise. Gets the morning sun. No one's ever claimed it. Too rocky for farming, too small for grazing." Clara stopped sweeping, leaning on the broom, and "It's got a good view of the plains," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Solid ground for a foundation. There's cottonwoods down by the water for lumber." She understood what he wasn't saying. He wasn't asking her to marry him, not in the traditional sense. He was asking her to build with him. He was offering not a life of ease, but a life of shared labor, a home they would make with their own hands. It was a promise more real and more profound than any ring or vow spoken before a preacher. "Is there enough space for a small garden?" she asked, her voice steady. A slow smile, a rare and precious thing, touched the corners of his mouth. "Enough for that," he said, "and then some." And so they began. Jonas filed the claim at the Land and Assay Office, a simple transaction that William Prescott was forced to oversee with cold, professional detachment. Then the real work started. Every hour they could spare from their jobs was spent on that small rise of land. Jonas, with his healing shoulder, did what he could, his movements measured. He showed Clara how to fell the smaller cottonwood trees, how to strip the bark, how to notch the logs so they would fit together. His quiet, patient instruction was a new kind of intimacy, a sharing of skills that were essential for survival in this land. Clara discovered a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. She hauled water from the creek until her arms burned. She learned to mix mud and grass for the chinking that would seal the gaps between the logs. Her hands, already calloused from kitchen work, becoming coated in the gritty plaster of their future home. The labor was grueling, relentless. Some evenings, they would return to their separate rooms too exhausted to speak, their bodies aching, their muscles screaming in protest. But it was a shared exhaustion, a good and honest weariness that came from creating something solid and real where before there had been only empty ground. The town watched, and then, slowly, it began to help. Their acceptance was not given in words, but in actions. Cooper the blacksmith, without being asked, appeared one day with a set of heavy, hand-forged iron hinges for their door and shutters. "House needs to be able to shut out the winter," was all he said. A gruff offering of friendship. Sadie would pack them a basket of bread and cold meat, scolding them for forgetting to eat. Mr. Hanson sold them nails and a precious glass window pane at a price far below what he charged others, calling it a discount for civic improvement. They were no longer outsiders. Their sweat and labor were weaving them into the very fabric of the community. There were still those who whispered. One afternoon, as Clara was buying thread at the general store, she overheard two of the ranchers' wives, the same women from the Founders' Day dance. "It's a strange match, is all I'm saying," one murmured to the other. "A woman of her background. And him, who knows what he was before he came here. A year ago, those words would have sent a shard of ice through Clara's heart. They would have undone her. Now, she felt only a faint, weary annoyance. She paid for her thread, offered the women a polite, direct nod that made them flush and fall silent, and walked out. Later that evening, as she and Jonas sat by a small fire on their building site, she told him what she had heard. He listened, his face impassive in the firelight. When she was finished, he simply reached out and took her hand, his thumb gently tracing the new calluses on her palm. He didn't offer a defense or an angry retort. He didn't have to. His touch, solid and real, was the only answer she needed. Their worth was not something to be debated by gossips. It was being built, log by log, on this hill. The house took shape. It was not large or grand. It was a simple, two-room cabin, with a stone hearth Jonas built with rocks from the creek bed, and a single window that faced the rising sun. It was imperfect. The floorboards were slightly uneven, and one wall was a little crooked where Jonas's shoulder had given him trouble. But it was theirs. Every log, every stone, every nail held the memory of their shared effort. The day they moved in was a quiet one. They owned little between them, and it took only a single wagon trip to transport their meager belongings. That evening, they stood on the small porch they had finished just the day before. The sun was setting, bleeding fiery color across the vast, empty canvas of the sky. The wind, a constant presence in this land, whispered through the tall grass. The dangers of this place had not vanished. There would be other storms, other droughts, other threats riding in on the horizon. The world was still wild and unpredictable. But standing there, on the porch of the home they had built, Clara felt a profound and lasting peace. This life was not the one she had imagined for herself, but it was so much more real. Her love story was not written in elegant letters or whispered in fancy ballrooms. It was written in the scars on her hands and the quiet strength in her heart. It was found in the steadfast presence of the man standing beside her. Jonas slipped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. His touch was no longer hesitant, but sure and familiar. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear, leaving the sky to the stars. Love, Clara knew now, was not about finding a perfect person or a perfect life. It was not about being shielded from the harshness of the world. It was about finding the courage to build a shelter together, right in the heart of the storm. It was the simple, breathtaking bravery of choosing to stand next to someone, imperfections and all, and vowing to face whatever came next, together. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.